All right, welcome back to the Fighter Pilot Professor. I am your host, Meta. Glad you're here. Today we're going to be talking about the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Cold War, and we'll also be talking a little bit about how to face criticism. As always, you can get this podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and you can follow me on Instagram and YouTube, the Fighter Pilot Professor. Hit that like button, follow me, so the algorithm will push me up to the top, and that'll help me out, help you out find my podcast. We'll jump right in. Welcome to the Fighter Pilot Professor podcast. I'm your host, Meta, and in the Fighter Pilot Professor podcast, every week we examine world events and your daily life through the mind of a fighter pilot. The episodes answer your questions, harnessing my experience in 25 years of flying fighter jets and my PhD in history, policy, and strategy. You can tune in wherever you find your favorite podcast. You can follow me on Instagram and on YouTube, the Fighter Pilot Professor. All right, so here we are, just past the 35th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. So, if you're in the younger generation, let's say, you don't really have a memory of this. I do. I'm that old that I remember all the way back to the late 1900s. And so on November 9th, 1989, the Berlin Wall started to come down. And it was a big deal. These famous pictures that you see of people crawling on the wall, it marked the end, really, of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. And also it marked the end of Soviet communism in Eastern Europe. Eventually, it marked the end of the collapse of the Soviet Union, or the beginning of the collapse of the Soviet Union, really. This obviously, it started, the Cold War, it started between the United States and the Soviet Union at the end of World War II. The U.S. and the Soviet Union were really the two remaining superpowers at the end of the war. The Soviet Red Army had marched across Eastern Europe, from the gates of Stalingrad and Moscow, past Berlin. And when the war ended in May of 1945, the Soviet Red Army occupied essentially from central Germany all the way east, a line that marked that. And that's effectively where, after the war ended, that's effectively where Soviet influence spread. Whereas anywhere that was east of that line through central Germany marked Soviet-controlled or Soviet-influenced communist states. And west of that line marked Western-influenced democracies. It even divided the nation of Germany into East and West Germany, and marked a really ideological struggle between the Soviets and the U.S. And the first person to begin the conversation around the idea of the Cold War arguably was Winston Churchill. He gave a speech in a small college in Missouri in 1946 where he first used the phrase the Iron Curtain to describe the sort of sealing off of Eastern Europe by the Soviets and the installation of communist governments in the Soviet sphere of influence. And so the Soviets really kept their forces. The Soviet Red Army stayed in Eastern Europe and in Eastern Germany. And this led to sort of a militarization, particularly in Germany, between Western powers, the U.S., France, Great Britain primarily, and the Soviet Union. There were several crises. We're not going to jump into all those along this, but eventually, it led to a division of the state of Germany into East Germany, which was communist controlled, and West Germany, which was democratic. And Berlin, the city of Berlin itself, was divided between communist-controlled East Berlin and democratic West Berlin. And in 1961, in August of 1961, the Soviets actually constructed a wall along that east-west barrier between East Germany and West Germany, and specifically in Berlin. And the reason why the Soviets did this, frankly, is because there was, in a sense, a brain drain from Eastern Europe. A lot of academics and specialists in science and math, etc., were fleeing Eastern European nations to the West because the Soviets were often sort of conscripting them into their projects, so their military projects, their scientific research projects, etc. And so as a result of that, the academics and specialists were fleeing, and a lot of economic resources were fleeing as well. So business owners, other industry, etc., were moving out of Eastern occupied nations and into Western Germany, into West Germany, into other Western nations. And so in order to sort of stop that flow, the Soviets constructed this wall in 1961, and it effectively became a militarized border between, the democratic West and the communist East. Obviously, the Cold War marked a lot of tension, threat of thermonuclear war and the ideas of mutually assured destruction as the U.S. and the Soviet Union built their nuclear deterrent forces and nuclear missiles and the space race and other things. And although it wasn't an open hostile shooting war, it was this ideological war. And then obviously the U.S. and the Soviets fought several conflicts, including where Soviet forces and U.S. forces fought each other. So, from the U.S. perspective, primarily in Korea and in Vietnam. There were obviously conflicts in other places, the Soviets eventually fighting in Afghanistan. And so you see these sort of hot wars breaking out along the peripheral of U.S. and Soviet interests, even though the Soviets and the United States never really went to open warfare between each other. There was this steady level of conflict between the two nations. In the 1980s, the Soviet Premier Gorbachev attempted, and there had been, sort of a decade or so of thawing relationships between the U.S. and the Soviet Union during the end of the Nixon administration, Carter, Ford, and then there was some thawing of relationships when Ronald Reagan came into power. He took a slightly harder line, and sort of in response, the Soviet Premier Gorbachev instituted reforms within the government and in sort of an opening of Soviet and Eastern European communist control. So there was more trade, there was more travel, etc. And frankly, this coupled with several economic factors in Eastern Europe, there was a large economic downturn in most Eastern European countries and in the Soviet Union itself, along with, sort of a decades-long propaganda campaign on the part of the United States and its Western allies, things like Radio Free Europe, where we were broadcasting the messages, propaganda messages of the West of how good democracy and freedom were and that kind of stuff. And a general opening of communications, television, et cetera, on the part of the Soviets. And this eventually led to several democratic movements, including in Poland and other places, and gradually the sort of tightening of Soviet control loosened across Eastern Germany, and that eventually led to the sort of official fall of Soviet influence when students began tearing down the Berlin Wall in 1989. Interestingly, and I think significantly, the sort of fallout of that is, in my opinion, one of the biggest fallouts of that is that Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, was a KGB agent in East Berlin when this all went down. And frankly, I think, based on a lot of things that have happened since then and things that I've read, I think that this had a huge influence on his worldview around Russian power and what he needs to do as the leader of a resurgent Russia. So I think, the sort of disgrace and fall of the Soviet Union in that moment really led to Vladimir Putin's worldview on how, if he ever came to power in Russia, what he would do. And I think we're seeing that play out even in today, or particularly today, in Ukraine. So that little, moment in history, marking the end of the Cold War, this sort of 4-year-long, ideological conflict between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, or really Russian or Western democratic nations and Eastern communist nations, really came to that end. But you see the legacies. Obviously, we talked about Putin, but also you still see the legacies in U.S.-Chinese relationships. There's sort of a resurgent Cold War. So obviously, China is a communist nation still, and obviously was a communist nation before the fall of the Berlin Wall. And the U.S. and China had a similar tension during the Cold War, and although it ebbed a little bit during the 1990s and in the early 2000s, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, we see a sort of resurgent, new Cold War, as some people have dubbed it, between the U.S. and China. So there you go, a little history on the fall of the Berlin Wall, 35th anniversary of that. As always, like and follow me on the Fighter Pilot Professor on YouTube and Instagram. Keep hitting that like button. Push me to the top, as it were, right? And if you're listening to this podcast, you know where to get it on wherever you get your podcast. All right, so we'll jump into a topic about how do I face criticism. And I recently listened to talk at my church about, and during that discussion, the pastor brought up Teddy Roosevelt's Man in the Arena speech, which I'm a huge fan of. I'm a huge fan of Teddy Roosevelt. I think he's a really interesting character. But the sort of gist of the Man in the Arena speech is, that it's not the critics, right? The critics are not the people that count. It's the man in the arena that's willing to risk everything in order to win or lose, and the critics effectively, while they say words, their words are sort of hollow because they are not the ones risking those things, right? In a similar vein, I also like the Rudyard Kipling poem "If." Again, in the poem "If," he talks about listening to the crowds and listening to kings and not listening to them, and keeping walking with commoners and walking with kings and keeping your common touch, and basically sort of how do I balance my life between the sort of highs and lows, the thrill of victory and the agony of defeat, and sort of trying to keep a sort of moderate middle with all of those fluctuations. And so I think those two things are good to keep in mind when you're talking about facing criticism. And a while back, I was on a podcast and talked about, how do I measure criticism, and whose words do I trust? And we talked about the sort of closeness of the relationship with you, the expertise that they might have, right? As being two criteria with which you might measure critique. So, as Roosevelt points out, if you're going to be somebody who is willing to step out into the arena, right? If you're going to be somebody who's going to be a public figure, run for, student government or actual government, right? If you're going to publish a book, if you're going to, whatever, if you're going to try to achieve fame, or if you do achieve fame, if you're going to have a podcast even, right? Whatever it is, if you're going to step out there and try to do something that's worth doing, that's hard and challenging and frankly public facing, particularly if you tell people that you're going to do this thing, then you're going to face criticism. It's just a fact of life. People will look at your actions and they will judge them. for better or for worse. That's just how it's going to be. And sometimes, for better, like I said, they will judge your actions and they will say, hey, look, I think you're doing a great thing, but maybe here's where you're straying or falling or whatever, right? And maybe you should consider these things. On the other hand, people are just, internet trolls are everywhere. People are just going to try to tear you down. Why? Because that's just the unfortunate nature of humans. When they see somebody succeeding, they often try to tear them down. And I think that's a little sad. But, I think while, as Kipling points out, you have to listen to what those people are saying to some degree. You can't always abide in the thing that they say. And so, as I discussed on the Be One, Change One podcast a while back, there's sort of criteria that I go about of judging critique. One is, well, how close is my relationship with this person, right? Is this a random internet troll? Is this a close friend of mine? Is this a colleague, etc.? And I will take that into account. It's not to say that I will totally disregard all internet trolls and only listen to the people that are closest to me, but obviously the people that are closest to me, they care about me. They have a vested interest in my success, and they are genuinely looking out for my well-being. And so for that reason, I will weigh their advice, their critique differently than I will weigh the advice or critique of an internet troll, right? Similarly, if somebody has expertise in a field that you are into, right? Finance, podcasts, whatever, right? It will serve you well to take advice from a person who has traveled the road that you are traveling on. This is why we have instructor pilots in the world of flying, right? It's just to teach you how to do the thing, right? This is exactly what teachers are in school and college, professors, etc., right? Mentors are teachers, right? They are the people that have traveled these roads before you, and they see the pitfalls that you will face. They've faced the critique that you are facing, etc., right? And so if they are experts in that field, then you should, or likely, right, consider their advice. And that's doubly true, right, if they are a person who is both close to you and an expert, right? So if you build a relationship with a mentor who is an expert in the field that you want to be in, then I would heavily consider that advice, right? But you also have to keep in mind that, right, even people close to you, even people who are experts, and certainly the internet trolls in the world, are sometimes going to critique your actions for reasons unknown, right? Obviously, internet trolls critique your actions because that's what internet trolls do. That's how they get likes and follows, etc., right? By the way, hit the like button. But, sometimes even people that are close to you may offer critique of the thing that they're doing, that you're doing, because they don't understand it. They're afraid that you may be risking too much, etc. Right? And while that is worthy, right, they may not always be right. So you have to carefully weigh those things as you are listening to the criticism, right? And in the end, you have to know, as both Kipling and Roosevelt said, that like if you're the one in the arena, if you're the one taking the risks, right, then you're the one that has to bear both the results of the victory and the consequences of the defeat, right? You have to bear that in both cases, right? And you have to be willing to risk that. And so knowing that criticism and that sort of responsibility of both victory and defeat fall on you when you are the person in the arena, it sort of, I think it steels you for what's about to occur, right? If you walk into everything thinking that this is going to be fine and nobody's ever going to say anything bad, I think you are deluded, right? And or this is going to be fine, and even if I fail, it's not going to have long-term consequences for me or whatever. And again, I think you're deluding yourself, right? So just know, right, if you step out into the arena, that criticism is going to come your way, right? And so prepare yourself for that, right? just and similarly, just as Kipling says, right, prepare yourself for both the greatness of the victory and the sadness of the defeat, right? And if you are prepared for the critique and the greatness of the victory or the sadness of defeat, mentally at least, right, you can start to go, well, I can at least like keep this solid middle ground, and I will celebrate the victories for sure, and I will mourn the defeats. But I know that neither one of those things necessarily defines me, and the critique that people offer certainly also does not define me, right? So keep that in mind when you're out there doing the thing that you're doing, and good luck. I will not be your critic. Well, I might be, but I will try not to be your critic. I will try to be your mentor, right? As always, you can like and follow me on the Fighter Pilot Professor on Instagram and YouTube, and listening to this podcast wherever you find your podcasts. Have a good one.